Last week, I did a video investigating the merits of Su from the Binding Blade, and one of the things that came up pretty frequently throughout that video is how bows are actually quite desirable in Fire Emblem 6. Despite the fact that the community constantly memes on bow access and archers in particular, I posited that both Su and Shin are actually elevated by their access to this 2-range locked weapon. Of course, Fire Emblem 6 is weird. It's the game where swords are good and axes are bad, so everything is topsy-turvy. But it got me thinking, are bows actually as bad as they have the reputation for? Or do Western audiences just have a stronger memory of Fire Emblem 7 than they do of Fire Emblem Gaiden? So I thought it would be a cool idea to explore the history of bows and whether they've been bad or good more often. And my patrons agreed because they voted for this video topic pretty overwhelmingly. I figured I would take a look at all of the mainline Fire Emblem games, judge whether or not bows are good in them, and as a bonus, judge whether or not snipers are good in them. After all, I find games that make bow access desirable don't necessarily always have strong snipers. Sometimes it just ends up as an indirect buff to warriors and a direct buff to nomads. And since this is a YouTube video and I gotta get eyeballs somehow, we're going to put these bow rankings and sniper rankings into tier lists. That way my thoughts are organized in an easy to read visual message. Starting in Fire Emblem 1, bows were actually not the worst thing in the world. In Arcanea, swords are king, due to the way that the weight system works as well as their accuracy. But they lacked an effective way to attack at 2 range. So if you wanted to attack from 2 range, you had to use javelins and hand axes, which were kind of mediocre, or bows, which were still kind of mediocre, but sometimes a better option. Effective damage against flyers, and in particular wyverns, was helpful in the few maps where you face enemy flyers. Wyverns had really high defense, and so using either a bow or a Wormslayer was kind of the most effective way to take them on. I wouldn't necessarily call bows great, but they're definitely better than axes, and arguably better than lances, although that's largely irrelevant because, fun fact, in FE1 there's actually 0 classes that can use lances but not swords. So all of the lance classes just default to swords because they're better. However, I think one of the real things that makes bows stand out is the early access to Parthia, which was kind of this game's equivalent of an S-rank weapon. It was one of the 3 regalia alongside Gradivus and Mercurius, but Mercurius was Marth's personal weapon and Gradivus came much later. Therefore, bow users with a sufficient weapon level did get a significant bump from access to the Parthia. In particular, promoted Tomas and George could both use the manual in order to gain access to their functionally S-rank bow. I honestly think this is one of the cooler ways to boost bow's viability, and many ROM hacks have adapted this idea, giving you the S-rank bow early in order to motivate training your archer's bow ranks. For example, Vision Quest gives it to you in Chapter 2, and Call of the Armor gives it to you in Chapter 3. Honestly, considering their poor reputation, I expected bow's first outing to be much worse than this, but they have enough advantages that I feel confident saying bows have a niche. The farther you go into FE1, the more likely it is to devolve into the Marth and Minerva show, but so long as you are using a full team, I honestly think at least one bow user can justify their presence. Now, regarding snipers specifically, I also think snipers are pretty good in FE1. While Wolf and Sedgar are definitely better than Castor and Gordon for early game wyvern killing just due to the extra movement their horses grant them, once you enter the mid game, Tomas and George tend to be preferable due to easy Parthia access. As a fun aside, I do want to talk about the difference between hunters and archers because it's really weird in FE1. Archers were meant to be the more defensively oriented bow class, which is just such a bizarre concept. On the flip side, the hunter class was supposed to be the more offensive bow class, and horseman was not supposed to focus on either offense or defense, but instead be more balanced and also have horse access. But because the FE1 approach to class balance was just fuck it, of these 3 classes, only archers could promote, going to sniper if you use the Orion's Bolt on them. Since FE1 was a game where all stats capped at 20, it wasn't a huge deal to not be able to promote for Castor, Wolf, and Sedgar, but it did still feel like a bit of an insult. The next game in the series, Fire Emblem Gaiden, overhauled a lot of mechanics, but for our purposes, the most important one is the change to bows. The generic bow has 1 to 3 range, but if you equip a silver, steel, or blessed bow, you get 1-5 range instead. Like normal, they deal effective damage to flyers, although this doesn't come up super often because there's not a lot of enemy flyers. A couple of the monster classes are considered flying, but there's no enemy Pegasus Knights, and Wyverns don't even exist in Valentia. Despite this, bows end up being incredibly strong. 1-5 range is, well, it's quite frankly ridiculous to have on just your generic attacks. Bows are probably the strongest of the physical weapon types, although to be fair, they're only competing with swords and lances. Honestly, the only thing that stops archers from being the definitive best units in the game is that Gaiden gives you a lot of broken tools. Falco Knights dealing effective damage to all wyverns, triangle attack on enemy phase, the speed ring. In fact, the Gaiden iterations of just about every equipable ring are stupid broken. I think it probably goes without saying, but bows are great in Gaiden. And Archer is one of only 2 classes that can use bows, the other one being Alm's promoted class hero. So Archers, Snipers, and Bow Knights, which is the final promoted form of Archer, are all good in Gaiden as well. FE3 Book 1 is just a remake of FE1, but the addition of dismounting does somewhat raise Archer and Bow stocks. Paladins and Wyverns can no longer use the Gradavu indoors. This makes the Parthia's access to 2 range slightly more exclusive on indoor maps, and is especially relevant for dealing with the final boss. Additionally, Marth is not quite as overtuned as he was in FE1, so there's more of a need for a balanced team. Overall, I think bows are stronger in FE3 Book 1 than they were in FE1, but FE3 Book 2 is where we really get into the bow propaganda. While Marth's first outing waited quite a bit before introducing enemy wyverns, his second is not so kind. Chapters 2 and 3 of FE3 Book 2 immediately have the player face down very scary wyvern riders, including a moving boss in Chapter 2. At this point in the game, the weapons and units you have access to are very limited. Your untrained cavaliers will deal 0 damage to these wyverns. It's fucking terrifying. The game's Jagan Aaron can tickle them a little bit with the Silver Lance, but honestly the only reasonable way to take care of these wyverns is with the 3 bow users you have access to, Gordon, Ryan, and Warren. Gordon is particularly helpful because he has the weapon level for the steel bow, but all 3 of the bow bros are going to be very helpful while the rest of your army craps their pants in the corner crying. And this introduction will set a precedent that the game follows for the rest of the campaign. Wyverns show up frequently, and you're going to want someone who can deal with them using bows. Bows also benefit from the old Arcanea classic of the Parthia showing up much earlier than the rest of the Regalia, this time at the end of Chapter 8. It shows up in George's inventory, and George is a decent pre-promote, both with the Parthia and with other bows. Overall, I would say that once again bows are quite strong in Arcanea, both due to their prowess at killing wyverns and their early access to Regalia. As far as snipers are concerned, they're technically worse than hunters, since hunters are now able to promote into horsemen, but because of the game's emphasis on dismounting, hunters actually lose their advantage on indoor maps, with the dismounting penalty effectively cancelling out Warren's promotion bonus. Additionally, despite their lack of a horse, George and Gordon are just pretty solid units. So overall, I would say this is yet another unqualified W for archers. As we enter Judgrel, bow users get a lot of new tools. The first is the implementation of the Canto mechanic. Genealogy had the first and by far most powerful implementation of Canto. Mounted units can move after almost any action, including using staves and attacking. This allows for hit and run tactics, where a mounted bow user can shoot an enemy and then use Canto to move out of range, that way they don't have to deal with the bow's downside of not countering on enemy phase. However, it's even stronger than that, because this version of Canto allows you to equip a different weapon. This only applies to the game's 2 Master Knights, but they can use a bow on player phase and then equip a 1-range weapon so that they are able to enemy phase effectively despite having used a bow on player phase. Additionally, bows were indirectly buffed by the reworking of critical mechanics in Fire Emblem 4. Without the skill critical, most characters are unable to get a critical hit, unless they're using a weapon that has 50 or more kills. However, there are 2 ways to bypass this restriction. The first is by dealing effective damage, which is now just an automatic critical hit. The second is by using the Killer Bow, which is a bow that grants the user the ability to get critical hits. This comes relatively early and there are no other killer weapons in the game, so it is a boon to those who can use it. One final mechanical change that benefits bow users is the arena overhaul. Instead of the arena giving you random enemies to fight, each chapter has a gauntlet of 7 enemies that each character can go through to earn experience and gold. However, technically speaking, there are 2 separate gauntlets, one for melee users and one for bow users. Since bow users are always fighting at 2 range, their opponent needs to be able to counter at 2 range, which in many cases involves making the fights much easier. For example, at one point they change a Brave Lance into a Javelin because that is the only lance that can attack at 2 range. Considering all of these buffs that bows got, you might think that I'm going to rank them highly once again, but I actually think this is probably the worst performance that bows have. For one, the early killer bow is nice, but it's far from the only strong early game weapon you get. You get a silver sword in the prologue, and early access to a Brave Axe, Brave Lance, and Silver Lance as well. While being able to score critical hits on flying enemies is nice, it doesn't actually come up that often. There are a couple of groups of flyers in the first generation, and near the end of Gen 2 there's some pretty scary flyers as well, but I would argue that bows aren't even the most efficient way to deal with these enemies. In the Arcanea games, wyverns were incredibly difficult to kill without effective damage, but in Judgirl, I don't think the flyer squads are actually more dangerous than various horse and infantry squads. Your hyper-trained sword, lance, and axe users are going to be more than capable of taking on a bunch of wyverns. And speaking of your sword, lance, and axe users, they're going to be able to enemy phase much better than the bow users, and enemy phasing is sort of the name of the game in Fire Emblem 4. Throughout most of the game, you are facing multiple large squads of beefy enemies, and being able to one-round-one on player phase just isn't that impressive when the rest of your army is taking on hordes of them on enemy phase. The biggest benefits that bows give you is an easier time in the arena, but it's worth noting that clearing the arena doesn't actually help you clear the map, it is purely for self-improvement. So ironically, bow access helps units who have access to other weapons, but units who are bow locked are kind of in a weird situation where like, yeah, they do pretty good in the arena, but they're not going to really do good outside of it. I think it's fair to say that bows have a niche in FE4, but archers are not especially good in it. The biggest beneficiaries are the Master Knights, Leaf, and Lachesis, since they can use bows in the arena. Technically, they could do the Kanto trick to benefit from bows on player phase, but oftentimes I feel that they have more important things to do with their player phase actions. Unfortunately, things only get worse for bow users in Thracia 776. While the game is not quite as enemy phase intensive as its predecessor, it does have a lot of new mechanics that just do not benefit bow users whatsoever. Key among them is the capture system. Thracia's economy revolves around capturing enemy units, stealing their stuff, and then releasing them into the wild. Not only is this your only source of gold in the game, but it is required for some character recruitments, secret chapters, and special items. Crucially, however, capturing needs to be done at 1 range, so bow users need not apply. Additionally, while 1-2 range was pretty bad in previous games, in Thracia it is improved somewhat. Hand axes and javelins are still kind of shit, but you have options like the magical swords, high-rank master weapons, and some characters' personal weapons, like Orson's Pooji that he gets in Chapter 1. Combine this with the overall strength of magic in Thracia, and attacking from 2 range is suddenly a lot more common and doesn't require bow users as often. Worse still, flyers are just not especially common in Thracia, which is ironic because the Thracian Draco Knights are most of the flyers in Gen 2 of FE4. The first time you face any enemy flyers is in Chapter 9, and there's a couple more in Chapters 14, Chapter 14X, and some of the Route Split, but both before and after, flyers are pretty sparse. Partially because they just can't exist on indoor maps, and partially because the maps where they do exist are kind of easy to warp skip. And the scariest flyers are much more easily taken down by mages than by archers. There are a couple of maps that uniquely benefit bow users. Chapter 12X comes to mind immediately, but there are a few others as well. And it is certainly nice that mounted bow users don't have to change weapon types when dismounted, as this is one of the ways in which Thracia nerfs the Lance and Axe Cavaliers. But overall, bows are really not in a good situation in Thracia. I think this is the first time I would say that bows are actually bad in the series. Which is funny because it's also the first game, in my opinion, in which axes were good. Maybe Kaga signed some sort of blood pact with a demon that demanded either bows or axes be bad, but neither at the same time. The man is truly an enigma. In addition to bows themselves not being desirable, this game was the start of a trend that we will see continue forward, where archers just have really bad stats for basically no reason. The 4 primary bow users in this game are Tanya, Ronan, Robert, and Selfina, and all of them have pretty subpar stats for their levels and join time. Now, using scrolls, you can fix anyone's stats in Thracia, but the bow users are still facing, well, bow user problems, so I kinda think why bother? As we move on to the iconic GBA art style, things get a little bit better for our bowlock friends. Enemies are tough enough that you usually need multiple units to team up on them. So bows have the distinct advantage of being able to do chip without facing counter. While you could theoretically do this with javelins and hand axes as well, javelins and hand axes are probably at their worst in this game. Accuracy is a constant problem for most of your units, and while bows aren't exactly super accurate, they're definitely a lot better than the throwables. This is also the first mainline Fire Emblem game where longbows have 2-3 range, meaning that bow users can attack enemy mages or enemy jav and hand axe users without facing counter, which is, again, pretty nice. Another thing that benefits bows in Fire Emblem 6 is a large amount of the combat is done on player phase, making the 2-range lock somewhat less of a detriment. Moreover, there are quite a few maps where either the enemy variety or the geometry sets you up in such a way that archers can effectively enemy phase, even though they are 2-range locked. But of course, the biggest benefit of having bow access is the ability to deal 3 times effective damage to enemy flyers, and in particular, enemy wyverns. Wyverns first show up in what is commonly regarded as the hardest map in the game, Chapter 7, but they don't stop there. From then on, every couple of maps will feature wyvern enemies, and large numbers of them as well. Wyverns tend to be extraordinarily bulky and extremely threatening, with high strength, defense, and even respectable speed. In fact, enemy wyverns are such a centralizing trait that the reward for being able to wield S-rank weapons is effective damage against dragons, which includes and is usually used for wyverns. Sure, they are also effective against Manichaetes, who are even harder to kill than wyverns, but I think the wyvern effectiveness being tied to S-rank weapons is emblematic of FE6's enemy approach. In the words of General Murdoch, just throw wyverns at them. With all of this in mind, I think almost every Binding Blade team wants at least one bow user, and honestly, many of them would not reject 2 or 3 bow users, given the option. I think it's very safe to say that bows are quite good in Fire Emblem 6. But as for the question about archers and snipers, that is an entirely different matter, and I don't think it has a super straightforward answer. The game features 2 unpromoted archers in Walt and Dorothy, and 2 pre-promoted snipers in Klein and Igrin. Walt and Dorothy join early with, quite frankly, horrendous stats. The Chapter 7 wyverns are threatening enough that Dorothy and Walt can theoretically be useful at base, but realistically, they're not doing much beyond that. And even then, I think many players overestimate their prowess against the wyverns. Walt's access to accurate 2-range chip is quite nice early on when everyone is force deployed, and like I said, you are taking multiple units to kill a single enemy. However, due to the fact that he doesn't face counter, he's probably going to be chipping rather than killing, which means his experience gain is not super great, and even if you go out of your way to feed him kills, his growths are pretty bad also. Dorothy is in the same boat, minus the part where she doesn't take up a deployment slot. It's a shame because I quite like her design, but she really is just one of the more unfortunate units in the game. If these were the only 2 representations, I would say that archers as a whole fail, but Klein and Igrin are both pretty good in their own right. Klein is a relatively early pre-promote in either Chapter 10 or 11 depending on your route split. He joins with extremely respectable stats and an A rank in bows, so he can use silvers right away. He also conveniently comes right before a series of 5 maps where bows are extraordinarily valuable. Well, in 4 of them. 12x they're not really that good in. I would say he makes for a great filler unit throughout the mid-game if that's what you're in the market for. And even if you carelessly lose him in an Iron Man, Igrin shows up as basically a replacement, albeit with slightly worse stats than the average Klein would have at her level, and an entire bow rank missing. Still, at B rank she can use the Brave Bow, which is quite nice. I think the presence of these two, and especially Klein, boosts my confidence to the point where I am willing to say archers are good in the Binding Blade, just not the ones who start out as archers. And that brings us to Fire Emblem 7, my personal least favorite Fire Emblem. And I guess we can add slandering the good name of bows to the list of this game's sins, because I believe that it is in large part responsible for the bad reputation bows have had over the years. After all, this was the first game to be released outside of Japan, and as a result, the first Fire Emblem that a lot of people played. So I posit that it subconsciously affects how people think about Fire Emblem. With a lot of discussions being focused around GBA mechanics, those mechanics are going to seep into the public consciousness as the default. And oh boy, all of the mechanics and design decisions of Fire Emblem 7 are basically giant middle fingers to archers and bows in general. To start out, remember how dealing effective damage to threatening wyverns was a big appeal of bows? Yeah, that's gone for two reasons. The first is that there's not actually that many maps with threatening wyverns. Sure, there's a few, off the top of my head New Resolve and the Vita map come to mind, but for the most part, the enemies you're fighting don't really take effective damage from bows. But perhaps more crucially, effective damage has been nerfed from dealing 3 times the weapon might to 2 times the weapon might. This often hilariously causes situations where your archers just aren't able to one-round flyers or even deal significant damage to them. And speaking of the archers, let's talk about our early game archers Will and Rebecca, because as if to add insult to injury, they have some of the worst stats of the cast. In a game where enemy quality is relatively low, Will and Rebecca still struggle to deal meaningful damage to their foes. And let's talk about that low enemy quality, because it also affects the usefulness of bows. FE7's approach to difficulty is mostly to throw hordes of low-level enemies at you, taking a quantity over quality approach. Many people refer to this type of game as a enemy phase focused game, and I don't really like that term because I feel it's a little reductive, but it is impossible to deny that the best way to get rid of hordes of weak enemies is to have a bulky unit counter and kill them. Gigachads like Oswin, Marcus, Hawkeye, Pent, and Harkin are able to throw themselves into a group of scrubs, take a significant amount of punishment, and kill everyone who dares to come near them with 1-2 range goodness. Even on the instances where you care about initiating on player phase, such as killing some of the game's harder bosses, anyone with lance or axe access can just attack without counter by using the newly buffed javelins and hand axes. This is absolutely the worst showing for bows yet. It certainly says something about the weapon type when arguably the best 2 users of it are Wrath and Louise, who you are not deploying to actually do combat, but instead because you like their other benefits, Wrath having low constitution and high aid, and Louise giving an A support to Pent, one of the best units in the game. Things don't get much better in the Sacred Stones. Effective damage has thankfully been raised back up to 3 times, well, except for when using the S rank bow, which is only 2 times effective, both against monsters and flyers, but that's a weird quirk of the legendary weapons and not really relevant to our discussion. What is relevant, however, is flyers are actually pretty rare. They're not non-existent, there's some wyverns and death coils, but for the most part you're going to be fighting grounded enemies. But perhaps more importantly, 1-2 range is just as strong as it was in FE7, and the average enemy quality is even lower than in the prequel. Of particular note, many of the unpromoted monster classes are basically free wins for anyone who can counter at 1 range. And sadly, that excludes Naemi and Inez. Now, Naemi is capable of promoting into Ranger, but that doesn't really help her that much, because swords aren't very good. Besides, we're talking about whether or not bows are good in FE8, not swords being good in FE8. I think it's pretty safe to say that bows have almost nothing going for them. Hilariously, Sniper doesn't even get a crit bonus in comparison to the other footlocked single weapon classes of Berserker and Swordmaster. Instead, the theoretical draw to Sniper is its class skill, Sure Shot. Sure Shot gives Sniper a percentage chance to just magically have 100% accuracy. This benefit is nearly irrelevant, because Snipers are already one of the most accurate classes in the game, and enemies aren't exactly known for being dodgy in the Sacred Stones. In fact, this skill is so laughably bad that almost every ROM hack that uses it edits it to give it a damage boost in addition to its other effects. I guess it is fair to say that bows are slightly better in Sacred Stones than Blazing Blades simply because 3x effective damage, but it is such a small win. Oh boy, now we have to talk about Fire Emblem 9. This one's going to hurt because Rolf is one of my favorite units of all time, but he's also one of the worst units of all time. For the second time, bows have been reduced to 2 times effectiveness instead of 3 times effectiveness. This means that even in maps that are specifically designed around fighting a bunch of flying enemies, such as Chapter 12, bows are just not very useful. Rolf, the archer you have at the time, is not going to be one-rounding any of the crows unless you've given him a lot of favoritism. The theme of hand axes and javelins being extraordinarily powerful once again makes bow users cry, and Path of Radiance's approach to difficulty is, once again, quantity over quality. For most maps, the brain-dead solution of throwing a couple of powerful paladins and flyers out in the middle of hordes of enemies won't fail you. The theoretical niche of being able to attack without being countered is also undercut by Path of Radiance's love of 1-2 ring. In the mid and especially late game, most enemies will feature some sort of throwable, meaning that archers will still have to face a counter unless they use a longbow. Well, or the S-rank bow, the double bow, which in this game is locked to 4 range. It's also quite literally only usable by infantry, which means Rolf, Shannon, and Boyd are the only people with the privileges to wield this quite frankly stupid bow. Snipers do at least get a crit bonus and a more useful skill than Sure Shot in Marksman, which will put the enemy to sleep if it triggers. This isn't enough to salvage an otherwise useless class. Both bows and archers are downright awful in Path of Radiance. Radiant Dawn is a game that is incredibly weird for bow users. Early on in my evaluation, I had to face a simple question. Are crossbows bows? When looking at your supply and markets, they are listed under the bow category, but they are not labeled as bows in their item description. Moreover, having or lacking a bow rank is not what determines one's ability to use crossbows, and using a crossbow will not grant you any bow rank. Crossbows are simply specific class exclusive weapons, only usable by warriors, reavers, snipers, and marksmen. No other class can use them. Normally, I wouldn't say this was a huge deal. It's been done before in the series where, for example, longbows can't be used by mounted archers in Fire Emblem 9. But warriors and reavers don't actually have access to regular bows, only crossbows. Moreover, it's not just Silver Knights and Bow Knights that can't use crossbows, but archers can't use crossbows either, only snipers and marksmen. I feel like if a weapon class is something that archers cannot use but warriors can, then it's fair to say it's probably not a bow. This isn't a hill I'm going to die on, but for the purposes of this video, I'm not going to factor crossbows' usefulness into my evaluation of bows. Even if I did, they would probably only be a niche for bow users since they are mostly useful for shooting down birds in 3.13 or for giving beast foe to a crossbow user in the swamp map. Other than that, crossbows seem to be a tool that is mostly useful in enemy hands, and that's because they ignore your unit's strength, so most of the time, you're going to deal more damage with an actual weapon. Well, with the exception of Leonardo, whose stats are absolute duty. And speaking of Leonardo, let's talk about the instances in which bows can be useful in Radiant Dawn. Throughout the Dawn Brigade chapters, you are constantly outnumbered and outgunned. You often need 2 or more units just to take down a single enemy, and the enemy's numbers are far higher than yours. This means that much like Walt in Fire Emblem 6, Leonardo being able to attack without being countered is a boon to him. And to a lesser extent, the same is true of Shannon and some of Ike's earlier chapters. But this does not remain true for either army. Once units like Har, Zihark, and Nyla arrive, you suddenly no longer care about being countered. And in the rare circumstances where you do, hand axes and javelins can get the job done just as well as bows can. 1-2 range isn't quite as strong as it is in Fire Emblem 7, 8, and 9, but you can fix that by forging them, and suddenly they are even better than in the GBA titles. Additionally, while Radiant Dawn definitely has quite a few maps where you're doing most of your combat on player phase, there's an equal number where your ability to enemy phase is the defining quality that makes a good unit. Especially as we move into the mid and late game, route becomes a much more common objective. While there are a few situations snipers can leverage in order to effectively enemy phase, by and large they are going to be player phase units. In addition to this focus on routes, bows were kind of hilariously nerfed in the transition from Path of Radiance to Radiant Dawn, as wyverns no longer take effective damage from anti-flyer weapons. This isn't a huge deal, as there's a surprising lack of enemy wyverns, but it is annoying on the few instances when it comes up. The biggest boon that snipers have in Radiant Dawn is Shannon, the sniper that joins in the Grail Mercenaries, just has really good stats. I'm actually a pretty big fan of Shannon as a unit in large portions of Part 3, but I don't view bows as a positive part of his kit. Rather, he is good despite being bow locked. Now, I know people are going to yell at me in the comments if I don't talk about it, so the double bow does return in Radiant Dawn, and it has seen a buff since Path of Radiance. It is now a 1-2 range weapon, and since marksman gets a +1 to their bow range, it is effectively 1-3 range if used by Shannon, Rolf, or Leonardo. I often see the double bow cited as one of the reasons that Shannon is good, and while it's definitely a buff over the Path of Radiance weapon, I'm going to have to disagree on it being a significant part of his kit. It's nice that he can finally effectively enemy phase throughout the tower, but the only one in which he's going to be doing this is floor 1. The second floor is a one-on-one duel between Ike and Zelgius. The third floor is a dragon killing map, where I guess you could fight the dragons with the double bow, but it's much easier to just charge the boss and murderize him. And a similar thing is true of the 4th and 5th floors. In fact, on floor 5, the only relevant enemies, Ashura and her various auras, don't even attack on enemy phase. Instead, the auras just sit there doing nothing, and Ashura cycles through a series of AoE spells. If we're being generous, that's 1.5 floors of the tower that he can make use of the double bow. The double bow is not what makes Shannon good, it's the fact that he has incredibly good stats at the point in the game that he joins. With all of that being said, I think it is safe to say that bows are pretty bad in Radiant Dawn. Shannon is the exception that proves the rule. You do not want to be bow locked, and you really don't want to be an archer or a sniper. I'm sorry, Leonardo is an incredibly fun unit, but that doesn't make him an incredibly good one. And as much as I love my best boy Rolf, even he would admit that he is a low-tier unit in Radiant Dawn. Fire Emblem 11 was a remake of Fire Emblem 1, and as a result, most of what I had to say about bows earlier still applies, with a few exceptions. The ability to increase weapon might via forges does definitely help with the effective damage, but the overall lack of flying enemies in Fire Emblem 11 means that this is a less meaningful buff than you would think. Instead, the biggest boon is simply how threatening enemies are. Once again, being able to attack without facing a counter is a useful trait. Much like in FE1, Parthia coming early is also quite nice. However, remember a few moments ago when I talked about using forges to increase effective damage on bows? Well, that also applies to armor and especially horse effective weapons. The majority of enemy units are dealt effective damage by horse slayers, and as a result, giving a horse slayer or the wing spear incredibly high might becomes the most effective way to kill enemies. If you're doing this, then you probably don't need the chip that Gordon and Castor can provide. Still, bows are nice on the 3 chapters before you have access to forging, and early Parthia is enough of a boon that I feel like it's fair to say bows have a niche in Shadow Dragon, but it is a fairly minor one. And if you end up warp skipping the game, then they probably come up 0 times after chapter 3. Due to the way that the reclassing system works, however, it's hard to say that Archer and Sniper are especially good classes. The only bow-wielding class that archers can reclass into is, well, Archer and Sniper. Meanwhile, Horsemen and Generals can swap between high defense and high movement depending on which is better for the situation. The biggest boon that Sniper offers you is a higher inherent bow rank, which George definitely benefits from as the easiest go-to Parthia user. I'd still probably rather have access to the Hunter General class set, but Sniper isn't terrible, it's just not great. Bows in FE12 come with all of the benefits of FE3 and the benefits of FE11. You want strong effective damage against flyers at every point in the game, but especially early. and you have the ability to forge bows to increase the effective damage they do to flyers. It is a match made in heaven, and it makes being a bow user something that many people actively change class to do. However, even more beneficially, the class sets have been merged, so now male units have access to Sniper, Horseman, and General, and female units can jump between General and Sniper. This allows your bow specialists to use whichever class would be best suited to their talents for the specific map. All of this on its own would make FE12 a game where bows are great, but there's even more that they benefit from, and that is the addition of the highest difficulty Lunatic Reverse Mode, which is functionally a challenge run difficulty baked into the game, where all enemies gain Vantage Plus, meaning that they will always go first in combat if they are capable of counterattacking, even on player phase. But if you attack with an archer, they aren't able to counterattack you. So now suddenly being 2-range locked is not only not a detriment, but it is an active benefit to you. I feel fairly confident saying that this is the strongest bows have been so far. Although I will freely admit that FE12 is my area of weakness when it comes to Fire Emblem knowledge, so I might just be completely off base here. As for whether or not Archer/Sniper is a good class line, I'm not entirely certain. I know that in the early game people tend to prefer Hunter because it has better class modifications. I've also been told that on the higher difficulties, the bulk offered by generals can be relevant, and of course having a horse means more movement, so Horseman is probably beneficial for that reason. But I also know that as you get into the mid-game and late game, class caps become much more important, and I'm not certain if these Sniper class caps help you reach any important thresholds that Horseman in general cannot. I'm going to go on the safe side and say that Archer is good in FE12, but if you are an FE12 fanatic, please correct me in the comments because this is one where I am kind of out of my element. Up next, we have the game that saved the franchise, Fire Emblem Awakening. And once again, the analysis of bows becomes somewhat complicated because they perform quite differently on different difficulties. On normal, and even to a degree hard mode, your units will be strong enough to do the majority of your combat on enemy phase. And as a result, bows being locked to 2 range is pretty strictly a downside. Don't get me wrong, even on hard mode, awakening enemies are quite strong, especially in the early game, but you've got Frederick to take care of anything that your other units can't stand up to. On Lunatic mode, however, bows become incredibly valuable. Frederick is still a god amongst men, but so are most of the enemies that you face. And all of your characters other than him will either get 1-rounded or 2-rounded. I mean, Frederick himself can still only stand up to 3 or 4 enemies before he dies. And your healing options, especially early on, are incredibly limited. Lissa has a heal staff, and there are no other healers until you get to Mirabelle in Chapter 4. You also get access to a single vulnerary and a single elixir before you can go shopping starting in Chapter 3. And while it might not sound too bad to have that limited healing for Prologue, Chapter 1, and Chapter 2, it absolutely is. Because enemies are so bulky, you're not going to be able to one-round with anyone other than Silverlance Frederick. As a result, you need to chip, and anyone chipping from one range will either die or get knocked down so low that they desperately need healing. Lissa can only heal one person per turn, and even if you discount the action economy that you lose by using a vulnerary on your turn, the limited access to healing items means that every time you use one, you are draining a resource that you will desperately need going forward. As a result of all of this, the ability to attack from 2 range and not get countered is huge for chipping down enemies. Varian, Robin, and Miriel are the only early game units with access to 2 range. And while you would definitely prefer the tome access for 1-2 range that Robin and Miriel have access to, I still view bows as a benefit, at least for the early game. Now, Varian's usefulness does definitely take a downward turn once we leave the early game and we're able to access 1-2 range as well as hyper-train our other units, but Bow Knight is still a good class to be in. It gives excellent pair-up bonuses, and swords and bows are not terrible in Awakening. So if you choose to invest in him, it's not like he's going to be a bad unit on Lunatic mode, and I think his excellent early game performance is enough for me to say that on Lunatic, bows are quite good. They get even better on Lunatic Plus, however. Enemies have the same stats as they did on Lunatic, but now they have a random assortment of skills. Of particular note, enemies can potentially have Vantage Plus, Aegis Plus, and Pavise Plus. Vantage Plus means that the enemy will always go first, even if you initiate the attack. The way this benefits bow users should be obvious. Much like when you don't want to take a counterattack for chipping, if the enemy has Vantage Plus, then you don't want to attack at one range at all, because you will always face a counterattack even if you're killing. Bows get around this problem by attacking at 2 range. Pavise Plus and Aegis Plus are a little bit more complicated. Pavise Plus halves the damage from swords, lances, axes, and beast stones. Aegis Plus halves the damage from tomes, bows, and dragon stones. The reason these 2 skills are relevant to bows' usefulness is that bows are the only physical weapon that is affected by Aegis instead of Pavise. This means that a physical attacker with access to bows and another weapon can attack an enemy who has Aegis Plus or Pavise Plus for full damage depending on which weapon they use. Specifically, this applies to warriors and bow knights. Once again, we see bow knight being a phenomenal class, and hey, it's a promotion option from archers, so I think it's fair to say that archers are good as well. It is worth noting that there are a couple of hybrid classes that can hit on either Pavise or Aegis, specifically Tactician and Darkflyer, although there might be some others I'm forgetting. The downside here is that mixed attacking classes do need to focus on both magic and strength being good, and it's rare that you'll find a unit who has both in excess. Certain builds of Robin technically could, but I think you generally would prefer to make one of your attacking stats the Bane. The point of all of this is the higher the difficulty is in Awakening, the better bows and by extent archers become. Although I do want to acknowledge that if you are playing on lower difficulties, Virion gaming will be a lot less rewarding. I guess you could reclass him into Wyvern or something. Wyvern's pretty okay on normal mode. The next game in the series is actually 3 games, because Fire Emblem Fates is just weird like that. Fates made a number of interesting changes to bows. For starters, they buffed the raw stats of bows. They are now tied with axes for being the highest might weapon, but instead of having axes' downside of being the least accurate, they are tied with lances as a middle-of-the-road accuracy option. Presumably, the reason for this statistical favoritism is they are 2-range locked, and that is considered to be a downside. But it is worth noting that this 2-range lock isn't quite as painful when you consider how nerfed javelins, hand axes, and the throwing sword Kodachi are. Fates has arguably the worst showing for 1-2 range weapons in the game. With the exception of hidden weapons in the knives and shurikens, they get to play by their own rules and just cheat the system. Javelins, hand axes, and Kodachis are unable to double. They lower your effective speed when calculating whether or not the enemy doubles you, and they're unable to proc any proc skills such as Soul or Luna. With this in mind, aside from knife and tome users, if you want to attack at 2 range, you're going to suffer a serious penalty unless you use a bow. In theory, hidden weapons and tomes are also supposed to be held back by their low might, but realistically forging solves this problem. Still, it is somewhat beneficial for bows to be 2-range weapons, especially when you're facing some more threatening enemies that Fates offers you. And for the first and last time in series history, bows are actually part of the weapon triangle. They have advantage over lances and shurikens. The advantage over lances is natural enough. All flying classes have the option to wield lances, and so it means that they will have advantage against the classes that they already deal effective damage to. It just makes them even better at sniping flyers, which is nice because Fates has plenty of threatening flyers. However, for my money, I would say that the advantage over hidden weapons is more impactful. Since knives and shurikens have inherent 1-2 range, it is very hard to enemy phase enemy ninjas. You could use your own hidden weapon users or your own mages, but these often end up being frail, and it's difficult to face a bunch of enemies with them as a result. However, if you position a bow user just at the edge of hidden weapon users' ranges, or use terrain such as walls and rivers to cut them off and make sure they're attacking you at 2 range, you can counter them with weapon triangle advantage, which is nice because ninjas are very dodgy. It's also worth noting that most of the bow classes are very strong on their own merit. units. Archer is a very desirable class set, with good modifiers both to bases and growths, and access to some of the better skills in the game. Quick Draw adds 4 damage to any attacks initiated on player phase. And if you decide to make the transition into Sniper, then Certain Blow will fix any accuracy issues you have on player phase, and Bowfare will add an additional 5 damage as long as you're using a bow, which snipers usually are. However, if you're okay with a slight hit to your stats, going from Archer to Kinshi allows you to have flight and bows. You also get lance access, which is okay, I guess, but the big deal is flight. There is another Hoshiden bow class in Apothecary, and this one is significantly less good. It gets some skills revolving around consumable items, which are neat but ultimately not super impactful. The ability to go Mechanist as a promotion option is nice because it gives you access to hidden weapons, but then it kind of feels like not really a bow class. The other option is Merchant, which is a gimmick class based around gold bars, finding them with its level 5 skill and converting them into damage with its level 15 skill. This is a gimmick that I find works better for enemies than it does for player units, but it is worth noting that there is a strategy with Midori where you delay her recruitment until the final map so that she auto-levels to the point where she gets Spendthrift. This, in combination with some inherited skills like Life and Death or Bowfare, can make her one of the better Takumi killers, but she is far from the only option for this role. And outside of that, there's not really any use cases for Spendthrift I can think of. On the Norian end of things, Outlaw is definitely a downgrade, but their promotion option of Bow Knight is still quite solid. It has a decent stat line, amount, and very good pair-up bonuses. Adventurer is pretty bad, although you can do some meme stuff with the Shining Bow, as that is the highest magic bow class. One of the more popular meme builds involving this is Shining Bow Nyx. The Shining Bow is a 1-2 range bow, and it doesn't have the restrictions that other 1-2 range weapons have, so it can be pretty nice as long as you have an archer with a very high magic stat. Don't get me wrong, this is pretty meme-tastic. You can make it work with the correct setup, but you probably would rather focus on using your bows on player phase. Now, with all of those advantages, it should come as no surprise that I consider bows to be quite good both in Conquest and in Revelations. I think they have a slight edge in Conquest over Revelations, as Revelations is a game where it is a little bit easier to just unga-bunga with some juggernauts, whereas in Conquest you really do need some tactics to approach the map, and as such your player phase actions are a lot more important. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Birthright's approach to difficulty is just large numbers of weak enemies. It's for this reason that bow-locked units tend to really struggle in Birthright. Setsuna is commonly clowned on as one of the worst units in Fire Emblem, and it's mostly because of Birthright's map layout. It's worth noting that Birthright also only gives you access to Yumis, which are just strictly worse versions of bows, but I don't think that's the main reason that bows are not good in Birthright. Like, don't get me wrong, it definitely doesn't help things, but if Setsuna and Takumi had access to the Iron Bow instead of Iron Yumi, it wouldn't really elevate them too much higher on the tier list. As a result of all of this, I think I'm going to say that bows are bad in Birthright, but good in both Conquest and Revelations. And of course, since I spent so much time gushing about Archer being the best bow class, it only seems natural that archers are also good in the Fates games. Fire Emblem 15, Echoes Shadows of Valentia, is a remake of Gaiden, but weirdly they seemed to decide that bows actually needed a buff. You see, this was the game that introduced the idea of combat arts, meaning that you could use some resource, in this case HP, to execute a move that is superior to a standard attack, usually by adding some might or some other additional effect. For example, the Wind Sweep skill prevents a counter, and the Armor Crush combat art is effective against armors. However, the most centralizing combat art in the game is Hunter's Volley, which was given to the Killer Bow. For the admittedly substantial cost of 8 HP, this adds 1 to your might, 10 to your crit, and 15 to your hit, as well as making all of your attacks brave, aka strike twice. Also worth noting that the Killer Bow keeps its initial 20 crit, so the plus 10 crit means that it lands at 30, or if you forged it, it can be as high as 40 crit on the combat art. Hunter's Volley is a truly ridiculous kill tool. Hitting twice with the 40% crit chance before the enemy even has a chance to retaliate means that your archers are the best units for killing other archers. And bows maintain the usefulness that they had in Gaiden. Well, kind of. Instead of inherently being 1-5 range, bows are 1-3 range, and the archer and sniper classes have a bow range +1 skill, whereas the bow knight class gets bow range +2. This does mean that Olm has to deal with the weaker 1-3 range bows, but like, they're still good. He still deletes everything with Hunter's Folly. Like, it's fine, he's fine, bows are still good. And then we move on to 3 houses. Much like with Awakening, I think the difficulty you play this game on will vastly impact your experience with bows. But unlike Awakening, I think they are strong in every difficulty, just in different ways. On normal and hard mode, bows' biggest strength is the fact that characters get access to the close counter skill. This means that you can attack from 2 range, and then counter all of the enemies even if they attack you at 1 range, as long as you have a C rank in bows or higher. And for those who have not played 3 houses, C rank is not a very high threshold. Especially on the lower difficulties, it is quite easy to reach simply through Byleth's tutoring for a couple of chapters. If you combine this with the fact that every single class in the game can use bows, they become an incredibly centralizing weapon for, well, basically all of your playthrough on lower difficulties. There's not really any reason to use other weapons unless you really want to, or you're using something powerful like a hero's relic. I will be honest, I find this approach to fixing bows kind of boring. I already feel like the melee weapons are pretty homogeneous, with swords, axes, and lances failing to stand out from each other, and bows being added into the mix as just another weapon type that is very homogeneous and can be used by every single class is something that I wasn't a huge fan of. Which is why I'm pleased to say that the ways in which bows are good in Maddening mode are wholly unique from the ways that other weapons are good. Well, kind of. They still rely to an extent on powerful combat arts, but I would say the most centralizing one is the early game combat art Curved Shot. For the incredibly low cost of 3 durability, you gain 1 might and 30 hit, which is pretty relevant considering how dodgy some Maddening mode enemies can be. But most importantly, this attack has 2-3 range. There are a bunch of reasons that this is relevant. It is the only way to attack enemy mages without facing a counter in the early game. It can allow you more flexibility in terms of positioning if you want to take advantage of might supports or Professor's guidance, or just need your unit to be in a different spot to free up a spot for someone else to attack from. And as I mentioned, the extreme accuracy boost isn't even irrelevant because it is hard to get reliable hit rates on some enemies even in the early game. Much like in many of the previous games we've discussed, enemies in 3 Houses Maddening mode are incredibly tough. Oftentimes you need 2 or 3 of your students to gang up on a single enemy in the early game. Meanwhile, some of your students will even be one-rounded by enemies. So being able to attack without being countered is very good, and Curved Shot makes that even easier. Of course, that is not the only way in which bows are useful for 3 Houses students. The Archer and Sniper classes get bow range +1 if you're in them, and Bow Knight gets bow range +2. If what you care about doing is chipping without being countered, these can help further enable that. Admittedly, this doesn't come up super often because in the mid and late game of 3 Houses, you're kind of just one-rounding or being one-rounded, but I have made use of it against some monster bosses. The more relevant upside of bows are its late game combat arts. Cyril and Leone have access to Point Blank Volley, which is a 1-range brave combat art. It's a very strong kill tool on the same level as Swift Strikes, and it is a big part of their endgame kits. On the other hand, Claude and Bernadetta both have access to Encloser, which is capable of inflicting the frozen status on enemies if there's a threat you need to neutralize but you can't kill this turn yet. But by far the most powerful endgame combat art for bow users is the one that is associated with the sniper class, Hunter's Volley. Just like in SOV, it adds 1 might, 15 hit, and 10 crit. It's brave and 2-3 range, and for the low cost of 5 durability, it can kill, well, basically anything. Seriously, Shamir joins with sniper bases, and in 0% growth, she is capable of one-rounding Maddening mode enemies on the final map of the game. Granted, she uses forges and her might support and bowfare, but even still, this should be a testament to just how strong Hunter's Volley Sniper is. This is why Sniper is often seen as an easy endgame class for characters who don't offer anything unique and just need to ride on the coattails of what the class itself has to offer. Basically, all you need is not to have a bow bane and you're golden. Characters like Ashe, Felix, and even my beloved Mercedes can make Sniper work for them. So, no surprise, bows are good in 3 houses, and heck, Archer is good in 3 houses. I do think that removing class weapon restrictions is kind of a boring way of trying to fix the problem with bows, but as it turns out, that also isn't what fixes the problem with bows, at least on higher difficulties. Sure, you can spam out a bunch of bow wyverns on hard mode and you'll be fine, but on maddening mode, you really do want to make use of the specific combat arts and skills that your students bring with them. And for the students that don't bring any, slap them into Brawler or Sniper. And that brings us to, at the time of recording, the most recent Fire Emblem, Enagge. From the offset, Enagge makes an effort to introduce bows alongside scary flyers to tell you exactly what their niche is going to be. On maddening mode, Etier is perfectly capable of one-rounding every enemy flyer on her join map, and with a boost from Alir's personal skill, she can do the same on the next map as well. Similarly, the first 2 maps after the game's second archer, Alcris, shows up, have multiple scary flyers that he can one-round with the steel bow. And the second one even has a ballista for him to access, although unless you promote him before that map, he's not going to be able to reach it until turn 2. While archers are not the greatest at taking on grounded enemies due to their inability to counter at one range, they do still have this valuable niche. Someone's got to shoot down those flyers, and it might as well be one of the snipers. Unfortunately, flyer killing duty is perhaps better suited for your warriors. Warrior is commonly considered one of the best physical classes in the game. The class modifiers and growth rates are part of why, but another big reason is it can use axes if it needs one range and bows for shooting down flyers. In fact, this specific combination can allow them to be very good Vantage Wrath enemy facers. If you give them a killer bow and killer axe and equip Emblem Leaf, then they will always equip the bow if an enemy attacks from 2 range, but the axe if an enemy attacks from 1 range. In combination with forges and engravings, you can functionally make a 1-2 range crit build. You do have to make sure not to level up Leaf's Bond beyond level 10, otherwise he'll start trying to equip the Master Lance and ruin your whole day, but as long as you don't engage that conversation, his Bond rank will never raise high enough and you'll be able to maintain this for the entire game. As awesome as this build is, it does make me kind of sad that buffing bows without buffing Sniper kind of just leads to Warrior or other bow classes outclassing Sniper. I mean, they are supposed to be the iconic bow class, but common advice if you want to use the early game Archer Etier long term is to reclass her to Warrior ASAP because it just has better growths than Sniper. There is one advantage that the Sniper class has, and that is the covert subtyping, which means that you can Astra Storm from 20 tiles away with a powerful bow equipped. But this in itself does not feel like enough to save the Sniper class. Its best use case is reclassing a high magic mage to use a 20 range Astra Storm with the Radiant bow, or having a high strength character like Amber or Panette do it with a physical bow. While I do think that these use cases are useful, and I wouldn't call them a meme, I also don't think they are as easily carries as Mage Knight and Warrior could be. Ultimately, sadly, this is a game where I would consider bows to be good, or at the very least have a solid niche, but I still think the Sniper class is pretty weak. It's kind of a downer to end on, and I think it shows the dangers of reclassing. If we are going to remain in this post-Fodlan infinite reclassing version of Fire Emblem, then you need to not only buff bows, but also buff the Sniper class, lest it be left behind. 3 Houses and Fates did a good job of making inherent traits of the Sniper class desirable on top of the desirable traits of bows. But to an extent, Enagge fails to do that. Oh god, did I just turn this video into another 3 Houses succeeds where Enagge fails talking piece? Yeah, there's no way we're ending on that note. Instead, I want to take a look at where bows fell in our tier list throughout the series. There are 6 games where I would describe bows as bad: Radiant Dawn, Thracia, Birthright, Sacred Stones, Fire Emblem 7, and Path of Radiance. On the other hand, there are 9 games in which I think having a bow is genuinely good, those being Gaiden and its remake FE15, FE3 and its remake FE12, Conquest, Revelations, Awakening, Fire Emblem 6, and 3 Houses. Engage, FE1, FE11, and FE4 are games where bows have a niche, but not a huge one. What I gather from this is that, at least from my evaluation, bows are good significantly more often than they're bad. Like I said, talking about Fire Emblem 7, I think bow's bad reputation comes from the fact that many non-Japanese players started with Blazing Blade, Sacred Stones, or Path of Radiance, games in which bows are at their absolute worst. Additionally, it is worth noting that on the lower difficulties of Awakening, bows are pretty bad. And some of the advantages to bows, such as Hunter's Volley in SOV and 3 Houses, are a little bit more obscure and require some game knowledge to access. For example, if you don't know how to forge the killer bow, then you don't know about Hunter's Volley in SOV. But bows are still 1-5 range in that game, so I don't think they give a bad impression. If there's one thing that you take away from this video, it's to stop saying that bows are usually bad. They're not. They're bad in the GBA games and Tellius, which is basically an extension of the GBA games, but that's not even true because they're good in Fire Emblem 6. Before we go, I do want to thank fellow YouTuber Juniper Jungbi for the idea that sparked this video, and I also want to thank my Patreons. So, thank you to Cynthia, Jamie Collins, Marin Karen, Thick Molder, Danielle Kalaskis, Jake in his Nest, Julia Kyoto, Arvis, Belle Wenska, Autumn Kelsey, Lilzabeth, Len, Gameboo, Carosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Saxon, Seraphew58, Reflect, Mara McLean, Calamity Callie, Queen Elizam, Tailored Muffin, George Grenville the 7th PM, SUP, Caius Cole, Gabe the Green, Controlled Aegis, Joanna the Wrenchwitz, Juniper Jungbi, again, Ginger, and Dysike. Your support means more than I can express in words. You're all awesome, almost as awesome as Bow Access is. If you are interested in joining these lovely fellows in the credits, then there is a link to my Patreon below, which features early videos, polls that influence the channel, and a couple of other benefits that are too spicy for YouTube. But please, 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 only donate if you can afford to do so safely. Free ways to support the channel include liking, subscribing, commenting, and just watching the videos if you like them. But regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.